Chapter 1. A Morning Disturbed in Willowbrook. The first light of an early September morning lay softly across Willowbrook, a quiet village folded among gentle hills and hedgerows. Mist clung to the green beyond the churchyard, and the cobbles outside the post office gleamed faintly with dew. It was the sort of morning that promised only the usual: milk deliveries, bicycles rattling toward the station, and the low chime of St. Mildred's bell. Inside the Willowbrook Arms, a modest but tidy inn facing the square, Mr. George Hayling went about setting out the breakfast tables. He liked the rhythm of arranging cutlery and wiping the polished oak, and scarcely noticed that the occupant of room 4, a middle-aged gentleman who had signed the register as Mr. Edward Lysander, had not yet appeared. Guests often enjoyed a late morning in the countryside, and Mr. Hayling prided himself on not disturbing them unnecessarily. By 8:30, however, unease crept in. The kettle hissed on the hob, bacon crackled in the pan, and still there was no sound from upstairs. George tapped lightly at room 4's door, then waited. Silence answered. He hesitated, knocked a little louder, and finally tried the handle. The door opened at once. The bed lay turned down as if its occupant had meant to retire, yet the coverlet was smooth, the pillow uncreased. Beside the window stood Mr. Lysander's suitcase, closed but unlatched. A pair of spectacles rested on the nightstand. What chilled George most was the absence of the man himself, as though he had stepped out into the dawn and simply melted into the mist. 10 minutes later, the inn's dining room buzzed with speculation. Mrs. Partridge, who never missed a chance to involve herself, declared it most unwholesome for a gentleman to leave without so much as a cup of tea. The vicar's wife, thin and pale with curiosity, ventured that perhaps the stranger had been called away on urgent business. George, wringing his hands, could not shake the image of the untouched bed. By noon, Sergeant Riggs from the county constabulary had arrived, his boots muddy from the lane. He questioned George in the taproom, inspected the suitcase, and frowned at the single set of footprints leading from the inn's back door toward the meadow. Footprints that stopped abruptly at the hedge. Word traveled swiftly, as it always did in Willowbrook. At the post office, Miss Harriet Blake paused halfway through selling stamps to recount every detail she'd heard on excellent authority. The grocer swore that strangers meant trouble. The blacksmith insisted it would come to nothing at all. Only one person seemed entirely unsurprised. From the neat garden behind her cottage on the High Street, Miss Jane Marple trimmed an unruly rose and listened to the gossip borne on the breeze. A small crease of thought touched her brow, then vanished as she snipped another stem. To anyone watching, she looked only like a pleasant elderly lady intent on her gardening. Yet behind those clear blue eyes a quiet question had taken root. Why would a man book a room, leave his belongings, and vanish before breakfast, leaving a bed perfectly empty? Miss Marple placed her seccateur on the garden table, brushed a petal from her sleeve, and reached for her straw hat. Something, she felt, was not as simple as it appeared, and she had learned long ago that such absences often heralded darker things to come. Chapter 2. Whispers over tea. By the following morning, Willowbrook had woven the mystery of the empty bed into every conversation. The milkman heard it from Mrs. Partridge before he reached the square, and by the time the first customers arrived at the grocer's, speculation had blossomed into a dozen colorful tales. At the Willowbrook Arms, Mr. Hayling moved about his duties with an anxious stiffness. He had slept poorly, troubled by thoughts of room 4 and its silent occupant. He found himself glancing at the staircase whenever the door opened, half expecting Mr. Lysander to descend, smiling apologetically, explaining some muddled errand or sudden departure. But the stairs remained empty, and the closed suitcase upstairs still waited to be claimed. Around 10 o'clock, Miss Marple appeared at the inn, greeted by a flustered George. She wore a pale blue cardigan and a sensible straw hat, her expression one of kindly concern rather than alarm. "Good morning, Mr. Hayling," she said, setting down a small wicker basket of apples. "I thought you and Mrs. Hayling might enjoy some of these. My trees have been most generous this year." George, grateful for her calm presence, ushered her into the parlor and offered tea. Over the delicate chink of china, he recounted everything once more. The tidy bed, the untouched breakfast, the footprints leading nowhere. Miss Marple listened, nodding occasionally, her gaze resting on a faded print of St. Mildred's Church above the mantel. She asked gentle questions. Had Mr. Lysander spoken much at supper? Had anyone seen him leave? Did he carry a walking stick or bag? Her inquiries were so mild, so naturally phrased, that George answered without hesitation. Outside, Sergeant Riggs stood by the inn's porch, consulting a notebook. He had interviewed the kitchen maid and the stable boy, and now regarded the meadow with furrowed brows. Miss Marple, after finishing her tea, wandered to the window and observed the hedge beyond which the footprints had vanished. Odd, she murmured softly to herself. How people disappear only when they very much mean to. By midday, the inn had attracted a small, polite crowd. Mrs. Partridge, of course, and Miss Blake from the post office, as well as 2 farmers who leaned on the gate, offering theories. Some suggested Mr. Lysander had gone walking and lost his way in the mist. Others whispered of robbery, or worse. Miss Marple took her leave before the chatter grew too raucous. As she made her way along the lane toward her cottage, she noted small things: the bent grasses near the stile, the faint scuff on a stone where someone might have climbed. She paused by the churchyard, gazing across the village roofs to the hills beyond. A puzzle was forming, though its pieces were scattered. Who was Edward Lysander? Why had he chosen Willowbrook, of all places, for his stay? And what lay behind that curious vacancy in the bed, as if the man had intended to sleep, but never reached the pillow? That afternoon, Miss Marple settled by her sitting-room window, knitting in her lap, eyes bright with quiet purpose. She knew human nature rarely hid itself completely. Even in a village as gentle as Willowbrook, truth had a way of peeping through, like grass through paving stones. And so she waited, for a misplaced word, a telling glance, some small detail that would point her toward the heart of the mystery. Chapter 3. The Letter by the Hearth. Rain swept across Willowbrook the next morning, silvering the cobblestones and pattering softly against cottage windows. In the snug parlor of the Willowbrook Arms, a small fire had been lit against the damp. Mr. Hayling crouched by the grate, coaxing the logs, when a folded paper slipped from beneath the fender and skittered across the rug. He frowned, wiping his hands on his apron, and stooped to retrieve it. The sheet was creased, faintly singed along one edge, as if it had been hastily thrust away from flames. Across the top ran a scrawled heading, "To be opened only in case of trouble." Beneath it, in a neat, careful hand, were several lines, though the ink had blurred in places from damp or careless fingers. George stood staring for a moment, then tucked the paper into his pocket. He was not a man prone to curiosity, but the note gave him a queer sense of responsibility. Before he could decide what to do, Mrs. Partridge bustled in for her customary elevenses, and he quickly slipped the paper away. By mid-morning, Miss Marple arrived, her umbrella shaking droplets onto the inn's flagstones. She greeted George with her usual gentle warmth, accepted a cup of tea, and settled near the hearth. "I was thinking," she began conversationally, "about our vanished guest. There's something peculiar about luggage left behind so tidily. A person who intends to flee seldom leaves his spectacles behind." George hesitated, hand drifting toward his pocket. "Well, ma'am, there's something else." He produced the folded paper and passed it to her with an apologetic glance. Miss Marple examined it carefully, smoothing the edges with delicate fingers. She read in silence, her lips forming the words, "If anything should happen to me, look first to the man who calls himself Hargreaves. He knows more than he pretends. And be wary of." The sentence broke off where the paper had been scorched. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained composed. "How very interesting," she murmured. "And how unwise, perhaps, for Mr. Lysander to leave such an intriguing fragment near an open fire." At that moment, Sergeant Riggs entered from the rain, stamping his boots. George nervously offered him the note, but Miss Marple raised a calming hand. "Perhaps," she said mildly, "it would be sensible to keep this matter quiet for the present. A little premature talk might lead to unnecessary alarm, or warn someone who ought not to be warned." Riggs scowled, but experience told him Miss Marple's counsel was rarely foolish. He pocketed the letter and promised to see what headquarters made of it, though his tone lacked conviction. When the sergeant had gone, Miss Marple remained by the window, watching the rain blur the view of the square. A name, Hargreaves. hovered in her thoughts, like a bird just beyond focus. She turned the note over again, noting the faint scent of tobacco and something sharper like varnish. Outside, a figure passed quickly along the lane, collar up, head bent against the weather. Miss Marple caught only the briefest glimpse. A tall man in a brown coat, walking with a deliberate purpose. Something in his stride tugged at her memory, but the thought slid away before she could seize it. She drew her shawl more tightly about her shoulders. Every small village she knew carried its share of secrets, and Willowbrook was no exception. The puzzle of the empty bed was no longer a matter of simple absence. It had sprouted roots reaching into places still hidden. And Miss Marple, with her patient mind, meant to follow them, quietly, one careful step at a time. Chapter 4. A call on Mr. Hargreaves. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the hedgerows sparkling with droplets. A faint breeze carried the scent of wet earth and chimney smoke as Miss Marple set out along the narrow lane that wound east of the village green. She walked at an unhurried pace, pausing now and then to admire a late-flowering rose or to greet neighbors with her usual gentle courtesy. Behind her pleasant smile, however, her thoughts turned constantly to the name written in Mr. Lysander's scorched note. The Hargreaves' cottage stood at the far edge of Willowbrook, a neat dwelling of grey stone with whitewashed lintels and an immaculately trimmed privet hedge. Mr. Hargreaves himself was in the garden, leaning over a wooden frame where beans still clung stubbornly to their poles. He straightened when Miss Marple approached, his expression quickly settling into politeness, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of wariness. "Good morning, Mr. Hargreaves," Miss Marple said pleasantly, resting her gloved hands on the gate. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Miss Marple," he replied, brushing soil from his palms. "Just tidying up the last of the beans before autumn sets in. Won't you come through?" Inside the cottage, the sitting room proved tidy to the point of sterility. Polished oak, spotless hearth, not a single cushion askew. A faint smell of varnish hung in the air, oddly reminiscent of the scent Miss Marple had detected on the burnt letter. She made a quiet note of it as she settled into a chintz-covered armchair. They spoke first of ordinary matters: the weather, the recent harvest, the prospects for the church fete. Mr. Hargreaves's manner was easy enough, but his eyes flicked once or twice toward the mantelpiece, where a wooden box sat closed. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander innocently about the room, remarking on the fine workmanship of the box without seeming to linger. At last she broached the subject that had brought her. "I suppose you've heard," she said lightly, "about the gentleman who disappeared from the inn. Poor Mr. Lysander." Hargreaves shifted in his chair. "Yes. Unpleasant business." He cleared his throat. "I didn't know him." Miss Marple nodded, letting a little silence fall before continuing. "Curious, though, don't you think? A stranger comes to stay, leaves everything behind, even his spectacles, and then vanishes." She smiled, an amiable twinkle in her eyes. "In my experience, such things rarely happen without someone noticing something useful." Hargreaves forced a laugh. "I can't say I noticed anything at all." But Miss Marple, whose hearing remained sharp despite her years, caught the faintest crack in his voice. Not quite fear, not quite anger, but a tightening that spoke of something unsaid. She decided, for the moment, not to press further. When she rose to leave, Hargreaves walked her to the gate. There she bent to examine a clump of late-blooming asters and remarked idly, "Such pretty colors this year. Funny how plants thrive when left undisturbed, though they don't much like being uprooted." Hargreaves made no reply, only offered a stiff smile and watched as she ambled away. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple brewed tea and laid her knitting on the table. Her mind turned over what she had seen: the polished little room, the smell of varnish, the guarded glance toward the box. And something else, a small smear of soot on Hargreaves's cuff, almost invisible, but quite distinct to one who knew how to look. She sipped her tea slowly. The threads of the mystery were tightening, drawing Mr. Hargreaves closer to the vanished man in room 4. But still, the picture was incomplete, and Miss Marple, who never hurried conclusions, resolved to keep her eyes open for the next quiet sign the village might offer. Chapter 5. The Box on the Mantel. That afternoon the sky over Willowbrook was the color of pewter, heavy with the promise of more rain. Miss Marple, seated by her parlor window with a neat skein of wool, let her fingers move automatically over her knitting while her thoughts strayed once again to the Hargreaves cottage. The little wooden box had not been remarkable in itself. Plain oak, brass hinges, no carving to suggest sentiment or artistry. But the way Mr. Hargreaves's eyes slid toward it when she mentioned the disappearance was telling. People often revealed more in what they tried not to look at than in what they openly displayed. Miss Marple set aside her needles and reached for a notebook she kept for such matters. She jotted down a few observations. Box on mantel. Polished oak. Faint smell of varnish, same as on Lysander's letter. Hargreaves. Soot mark on cuff. No photographs of family. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. A bachelor, she recalled, though not unfriendly. He had come to Willowbrook only 2 years prior, renting the small cottage after the death of its previous tenant. Little was known about him beyond his fondness for orderly gardens and occasional help at the church accounts. Her musings were interrupted by a brisk knock at the door. When she opened it, Mrs. Partridge stood on the step, breathless from hurrying along the lane. "Have you heard, Miss Marple, about what young Billy Carter found behind the smithy?" Mrs. Partridge's eyes gleamed with a relish of tidings half scandal, half fear. "A walking stick. Good quality, with a silver tip. Billy swears it wasn't there yesterday." Miss Marple listened with interest. "How very observant of Billy," she said mildly. "I should like to see it." Together they walked to the smithy, where the blacksmith had propped the stick against a barrel for safekeeping. It was indeed a handsome thing. Dark wood, silver collar engraved with the faint initials E.L. "Edward Lysander," Miss Marple murmured. She turned the stick carefully, noting a faint trace of dark varnish along its shaft, and a chip near the ferrule as though it had struck something solid. On her way home, Miss Marple detoured past Mr. Hargreaves's gate. Through the hedge she glimpsed him in the garden, locking the shed with deliberate care. Something bulky lay under a tarpaulin near his feet. He noticed her glance, lifted a hand in perfunctory greeting, then disappeared indoors. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple placed the walking stick across her lap and regarded it in silence. The pieces of the puzzle were multiplying: a vanished guest, a letter warning against Hargreaves, a stick found far from the inn, and a curious box that seemed to weigh heavily on its owner's mind. The old lady's eyes softened as she poured herself another cup of tea. She was not ready to draw conclusions. Not yet. But she felt, with the certainty born of long acquaintance with human frailty, that the key to Mr. Lysander's fate lay somewhere between a scorch-marked letter and a polished oak box, guarded perhaps by a man who had secrets he was not prepared to share. She set her cup down and picked up her knitting again, though her fingers scarcely moved. The quiet of Willowbrook that evening was deceptive. Beneath its calm surface, the ripples of a darker story were spreading outward, and Miss Marple intended to follow every one. Chapter 6. Inside the box. Morning sun spilled across Willowbrook in thin, cool stripes, lighting the puddles from the night's rain. At the Willowbrook Arms, Sergeant Riggs was holding court in the taproom, pronouncing loudly that the disappearance was a straightforward case of a gentleman losing his nerve. His theory that Mr. Lysander had left for London after a sleepless night drew polite nods, though several villagers looked unconvinced. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner with a cup of tea, listened without comment. She preferred to let others empty themselves of talk before she spoke. When the sergeant finally asked whether she had an opinion, she merely said, "It is possible, of course. Though it is also possible that Mr. Lysander intended to stay." Her tone was mild, but Riggs flushed and returned to his notes. After leaving the inn, Miss Marple wandered toward the east lane once more. She paused at Hargreaves's hedge, studying the dew-beaded privet. No sign of its owner was visible. She noted that the curtains of the sitting room were drawn, despite the brightening day. That afternoon she called on Mrs. Partridge, bringing along a small sponge cake. Over tea, she mentioned the varnish scent she had noticed at Hargreaves's and asked, as if idly, whether Mrs. Partridge had ever been inside. "Only once," Mrs. Partridge said, eyes widening. "For the harvest raffle. Place was spotless. He's not the sort for knickknacks. Just that box on the mantel said it held papers, though he snapped it shut the moment Mr. Hayling tried to peek." Miss Marple thanked her friend, then ambled home, her mind weighing possibilities. Late in the afternoon she returned along the lane with a basket of dahlias, ostensibly to leave for Mr. Hargreaves, since he had admired her blooms. She found the gate unlatched, and the door ajar. "Mr. Hargreaves," she called gently. Silence answered. She stepped into the sitting room, her gaze resting again on the mantel. The box stood precisely where she had last seen it, its brass hinges catching the fading light. For a moment she hesitated, conscience pricking. Yet common sense reminded her that Mr. Lysander's safety, or the truth about his fate, might depend upon what lay inside. The lid lifted easily. Within lay a tidy bundle of envelopes, bound by string, and, more curious, a narrow notebook with a green cloth cover. On top rested a small folded square of paper. Miss Marple read the few words written there. "Keep these safe. If I do not return by Friday, send them to." The message ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted. The envelopes bore various postmarks: London, Bath, even one from a seaside town called Westover. A pressed violet slipped from between the pages of the notebook. Miss Marple replaced everything as she had found it, carefully aligning the string and hinges. As she stepped back, she heard a faint creak in the passage. Mr. Hargreaves stood in the doorway, his face oddly pale above the collar of his brown coat. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, voice controlled but taut. "I didn't hear you knock." With perfect calm, she smiled and held out the basket. "Forgive me, Mr. Hargreaves. I hoped you might enjoy a few flowers for your table." He accepted the basket slowly, eyes searching hers, then set it aside. "Very kind," he said, though the words sounded as though they had been chosen with care. As she made her way back down the path, Miss Marple felt the first cool breath of evening stir the hedges. She knew, with the quiet certainty born of experience, that she had crossed a line, and that Mr. Hargreaves was aware of it. Whatever truths lay within that oak box, they were dangerous enough for someone to guard them closely. Chapter 7. Shadows at Dusk. Evening settled over Willowbrook with a pale lavender sky. Lamps flickered on in cottage windows, and the faint scent of wood smoke drifted above the roofs. Miss Marple, seated at her little table with an unfinished row of knitting, kept one ear attuned to the lane beyond her window. She had seen the tension behind Mr. Hargreaves's courteous mask, and experience told her that people seldom remain perfectly still after a shock. Across the village, Mr. Hargreaves sat rigid in the chair by his hearth. The basket of dahlias rested untouched on the sideboard. His gaze fixed on the oak box, but his mind wandered far beyond the neat room. At length he rose, unfastened the string about the envelopes, and drew out one. The handwriting inside was Lysander's, polite, measured, and urgent. "I have reason to think we may both be in danger. If I am absent longer than agreed, destroy everything at once." Hargreaves read the line twice, then thrust the letter back among the others. He fetched a decanter, poured a generous measure, and drank quickly. The notion that Miss Marple, that apparently harmless spinster, had seen too much gnawed at him. At the inn, Sergeant Riggs was entertaining a theory that Mr. Lysander had slipped away to France. Mr. Hayling nodded politely while polishing glasses, but the story failed to convince anyone lingering over their ale. Billy Carter, emboldened by the warmth of the taproom, repeated how he'd found the walking stick and suggested they search the meadow again, proper, with lanterns. Riggs waved him off. Meanwhile, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and crossed to the dresser where her telephone stood. She lifted the receiver, then paused, letting her fingers rest lightly on the dial. There was no need to hurry the police, not until she had one more piece to fit among the rest. Later, just before 9, Hargreaves slipped from his cottage carrying a leather satchel. The lane was quiet, the moon bright. He kept close to hedgerows, moving with the careful tread of one accustomed to secrecy. Unseen, Miss Marple watched from her darkened window, noting the angle of his shoulders and the direction he took, toward the old footpath leading to the river. When he was gone, she settled back into her chair, eyes half closed in thought. There was no doubt now. Hargreaves was entangled in whatever had drawn Mr. Lysander to Willowbrook. Whether guilty or merely frightened remained to be seen, but the hour for idle speculation was past. Miss Marple, calm as ever, reached for her notebook and made a small, precise note. "Follow Hargreaves to River Path." Observe carefully. No confrontation yet. Outside, the church bell marked the hour with a single solemn chime. Somewhere along the water's edge, a man with too many secrets was on the move, and Miss Marple, though patient, was not one to let secrets slip quietly into the dark. Chapter 8. Footsteps by the water. Mist had begun to coil along the riverbank when Mr. Hargreaves reached the footpath. The moonlight turned the water to tarnished silver, its slow current whispering against the reeds. He paused, scanning the meadow behind him, then set off along the track with quick, deliberate strides. The leather satchel bumped softly against his side. At a distance, Miss Marple followed, her pale scarf tucked under the collar of a sensible coat. She kept well to the hedge, her steps light despite the uneven ground. Years of village life had taught her how to move unnoticed, and she felt no unease now, only the quiet concentration of a gardener tracing a route beneath the soil. Hargreaves stopped where the path narrowed between alder trees. From his pocket he drew a small torch, its beam darting over the ground. He knelt, prized up a flat stone, and eased something wrapped in oilskin from the hollow beneath. For a moment he simply held it, staring at the dark parcel as though weighing a decision. Miss Marple crouched behind a clump of nettles, eyes steady. She could not see the parcel clearly, but she recognized the posture of a man debating whether to keep or destroy what he held. At length, Hargreaves slipped the bundle into the satchel, replaced the stone, and straightened with a sigh. He turned back along the path, retracing his steps toward the village. As he passed within a few yards of Miss Marple's hiding place, a stray moonbeam caught his face, and she saw that it was set, determined, yet troubled, the look of someone drawn unwillingly deeper into a tangle. When the lane lay empty once more, Miss Marple rose carefully. She approached the stone, stooping to inspect the hollow. Only a faint scrape marked the soil where the parcel had been hidden. Nearby, a sliver of paper gleamed faintly in the moonlight. She picked it up, a fragment torn from an envelope, bearing the printed words, "Westover Hotel." Slipping the clue into her pocket, she made her way home, her mind arranging the evening's discoveries. There was, she felt, a widening circle to this business, from the inn to Hargreaves's sitting room, to the riverbank, and now, perhaps, to a seaside town. Back at her cottage, she laid the scrap on the table beside the note from room 4. The two pieces seemed to speak to each other, though their message remained veiled. She allowed herself a thin smile. Matters were advancing, and the time was coming to draw the police a little nearer to the truth, though not so close as to scare it away. Outside, the river kept its own counsel, sliding darkly beneath the willows. Somewhere in the stillness a night bird called, and Miss Marple, folding her hands, thought how often danger lay not in the loudness of a crime, but in the quiet places where no one thought to look. Chapter 9. Clues across the map. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm-washed sky an unblemished blue. Miss Marple, looking out from her small kitchen window, felt that such weather suited her purpose, a day for walking about with a smile, making quiet inquiries that might otherwise have seemed too pointed. After breakfast she slipped the torn envelope into her handbag and strolled to the Willowbrook Arms. Sergeant Riggs was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee, lecturing George Hayling on the habits of London gentlemen. "Mark my words," Riggs was saying, "your Mr. Lysander hopped a train before you were out of bed. They do that in town, you know, vanish off to the continent at the first whiff of bother." Miss Marple, smiling gently, set down her bag. "You may be right, Sergeant. Yet I wonder whether a gentleman intending to cross to France would leave behind his spectacles, suitcase, and a rather nice walking stick." Riggs reddened, muttered something about further lines of inquiry, and turned his attention to the day's post. Among the letters was a thin envelope addressed to the innkeeper in an unfamiliar hand. George, encouraged by Miss Marple's interested glance, opened it. Inside was a single page, a polite request for confirmation that Mr. Edward Lysander had indeed stayed at the Willowbrook Arms, and could someone please forward any papers belonging to him to the Westover Hotel, Sussex. Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. The fragment from the river and the letter on the counter spoke in harmony now. "Westover," she said softly. "I wonder what business our missing guest had in that direction." After a little more conversation, during which Riggs insisted on writing to the Sussex authorities, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She spread her findings on the table. The scorched note, the river scrap, and now the hotel's address. Each piece nudged the picture further into focus. By mid-afternoon, she had made a discreet telephone call to an old acquaintance, a retired inspector who lived near the coast, asking whether he knew of the Westover Hotel. His chuckle down the line was fond but wry. "A very decent house, Miss Marple. Visitors come for the air and the golf. Nothing more sinister than the occasional bridge scandal." Miss Marple thanked him and replaced the receiver, her brow faintly furrowed. It was rarely wise to take outward serenity at face value. She had found that danger often wore an innocuous smile. Late that evening, as she trimmed the stems of yesterday's dahlias, she reflected on Mr. Hargreaves's moonlit errand. The man's burden was heavier than a handful of letters. She would, she decided, arrange a quiet visit to Westover herself, but not before learning exactly what the sergeant planned to do with his latest clue. Patience, she reminded herself, was the gardener's best ally. Dig too soon, and you disturb the roots before you see where they lead. Chapter 10. Road to Westover. The following morning found Willowbrook washed in pale sunlight, as though the storm and gossip of the past days had been nothing more than a feverish dream. Miss Marple, however, knew better. She rose early, packed a modest case, and left a note for Mrs. Partridge asking her to water the roses should she be delayed. At the post office she paused long enough to purchase a ticket to Westover-on-Sea. Harriet Blake, sorting stamps behind the counter, raised her brows at the destination. "Planning a little holiday, Miss Marple?" "Merely an excursion," said Miss Marple, tucking the ticket neatly into her purse. "It's wise, I think, to change the air now and then." By the time the morning train puffed out of Willowbrook Station, Miss Marple was settled by the window, knitting resting in her lap. As the countryside rolled past, she considered the delicate problem of Mr. Hargreaves. The man had secrets, that much was certain, yet she sensed something reluctant in him, as if his steps were driven by a force outside his choosing. A pity, she thought, that people so often let fear guide their hands. Meanwhile, back in Willowbrook, Hargreaves sat at his kitchen table, the satchel from the previous night resting beside him. He had slept little. The sight of Miss Marple standing in his doorway had lodged in his thoughts like a thorn. With an abrupt movement he opened the satchel and drew out the oilskin parcel. Inside lay several items: the notebook from the box, a sheaf of letters, and wrapped in soft cloth, a small object of dull metal. He stared at it for a long moment, then closed the parcel again, his jaw set. Whatever had begun with Edward Lysander, it had gone too far to stop now. He replaced the bundle in the satchel, locked it in a drawer, and checked the window. Across the lane Billy Carter was loitering with his bicycle, clearly hoping for news. Hargreaves muttered an oath under his breath and pulled the curtains. The train rattled on, carrying Miss Marple closer to the sea. She reviewed in her orderly way every piece of the puzzle: the untouched bed, the warning letter, the varnish scent, the walking stick, the moonlit cache by the river, and the Westover Hotel. Somewhere among them lay the reason a man had come quietly to Willowbrook, only to vanish before breakfast. As the train slowed for the next junction, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Human beings, she reflected, left traces as surely as birds left feathers in a hedge. One only had to look carefully, and be patient enough to wait until the wind turned them into view. When the coast finally came into sight, sunlight gleamed on water beyond the dunes, and the air carried a tang of salt. Miss Marple gathered her bag, ready to step onto new ground. Whatever she discovered at Westover, she intended to bring its secrets back with her, and perhaps in the process shed a little light on the empty bed in room 4. Chapter 11. The Hotel by the Sea. The Westover Hotel stood at the crest of a low hill overlooking a sweep of pale sand and restless gray-green sea. It was a gracious building, its red brick facade softened by age, with bow windows that caught the morning light. Miss Marple, stepping from the little motor taxi, paid the driver with a smile and stood for a moment, adjusting her hat against the brisk coastal breeze. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of beeswax and salt. A few early guests were gathered about the hearth, murmuring over newspapers while a tall clock ticked with unhurried precision. The receptionist, a young woman with chestnut hair and an air of brisk competence, welcomed her, produced the register, and handed her a key marked 12. "Your room looks over the gardens," she said. "Breakfast is served until 10:30. Miss Marple thanked her and ascended the wide staircase. In her room she unpacked slowly, noting the thoughtful arrangement of furniture, the slight rattle of the window in its frame, and the faint scent of varnish that lingered despite the sea air. Such things were often overlooked by others but not by her. After tea in the sunlit lounge, she strolled out onto the terrace. Beyond the balustrade, the sea lifted in gentle swells, gulls wheeling lazily above. A group of guests were discussing the arrival of a most elusive gentleman who had come and gone in recent weeks. Miss Marple's ears pricked up at the mention of a tall man with an Oxford accent and a walking stick. She introduced herself with the mildness of one accustomed to friendly talk. Soon, Mrs. Bletchley, a formidable lady in tweed, was recounting how the gentleman had spent long hours in the reading room, poring over shipping notices and sketching the coastline in a small notebook. No one knew his purpose, but there had been an air of watchfulness about him. Later, over luncheon, Miss Marple engaged the headwaiter, a dignified fellow named Pomeroy. She inquired delicately about visitors from Willowbrook. Pomeroy, after a moment's hesitation, admitted that a Mr. Lysander had stayed at the hotel under an assumed name and departed abruptly one stormy night, leaving behind a sealed envelope for an associate. The envelope, he added, had been collected early the next morning by a country gentleman with an anxious expression. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though she did not let her satisfaction show. Hargreaves again, a reluctant messenger perhaps, carrying something whose weight exceeded its size. As dusk settled over the coast, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the tide creep in. Somewhere in the spaces between Willowbrook and this quiet shore lay the key to the empty bed. The task, she knew, was to discover why a man had traveled from one refuge to another, only to leave an unfinished story behind. She folded her knitting and set it aside. There would be time tomorrow to ask further questions. For now, she allowed the sighing sea to lull her thoughts, certain that the surface calm of Westover held currents as deep and complicated as any in the village she had left behind. Chapter 12. Whispers in Willowbrook. In Willowbrook, the September sun had taken on a pale, watery quality, casting long shadows across the village green. Despite the calm weather, there was a brittle edge to the air, the kind that sharpened gossip and set curtains twitching. At the post office, Harriet Blake was recounting for the third time how Miss Marple had boarded the morning train with a case no bigger than a loaf of bread. Billy Carter, leaning on the counter, speculated that she had gone to London to consult the Yard. Others suggested she was visiting cousins or attending some mysterious church luncheon. Harriet, with a knowing look, declared only that Miss Marple rarely traveled without purpose. Across the lane, in a cottage with faded blue shutters, Mr. Hargreaves sat rigid at his kitchen table. The satchel lay in its drawer, but the knowledge of it burned in his thoughts like a hidden ember. Sleep had evaded him again. Each creak of the house had seemed to whisper his name. He had almost convinced himself to burn the contents, but caution, or was it fear, stayed his hand. There came a knock at the door. Startled, Hargreaves shoved the parcel deeper into the drawer and opened the door a cautious inch. Sergeant Riggs stood there, hat in hand, trying for geniality. "Morning, Mr. Hargreaves. Thought I'd see how you were keeping. Folks say you were out late other night. Bracing weather for errands, eh?" Hargreaves muttered something about insomnia. Riggs glanced past him into the dim interior, nostrils twitching slightly as though he expected the scent of wrongdoing to drift out. "Well, keep an eye open," the sergeant advised, giving the impression of a man who hoped to sound casual but whose eyes missed little. "Odd business, that empty bed at the inn. We'll get to the bottom of it, mark my words." After he had gone, Hargreaves sat down again, palms damp. Riggs's presence, though mild, had the weight of a warning. Somewhere between the missing guest, the riverbank, and that infernal hotel, a knot was drawing tighter. He poured himself a small glass of brandy and tried to steady his hands. Yet his gaze drifted inexorably to the drawer. He could feel the object inside, the one wrapped in cloth, as if it were pulsing faintly, demanding to be dealt with. By twilight, the lanes of Willowbrook were hushed. Smoke rose from chimneys, and lamps winked on behind lace curtains. Hargreaves stepped outside, drawn by a restless impulse, and made his way toward the meadow path leading to the river. The sky was streaked rose and violet. The air smelled of wet grass and approaching night. He paused at the edge of the trees, clutching his coat against the evening chill. Somewhere beyond lay the spot where he had hidden the parcel before Miss Marple's sharp eyes had startled him. He had thought himself clever that night, but cleverness, he knew, was a poor shield against someone who understood the way fear left fingerprints on a man's soul. Slowly, he turned back toward the village lights. Whatever he carried, the burden was not his alone. And though he scarcely dared admit it, a part of him wished the shrewd old lady would return soon, bringing with her some path out of the darkening maze. Chapter 13. Echoes along the corridor. Morning sunlight poured through the gauzy curtains of room 12, drawing Miss Marple from a peaceful but shallow sleep. She rose, straightened her pillows, and spent a moment gazing at the gardens below. The clipped lawns and scarlet geraniums might have been any hotel in England, but Miss Marple had long ago learned that the most placid scenes often harbored the most unlooked-for dramas. Downstairs, the breakfast room hummed with polite talk. Guests compared the merits of the beach promenade to the golf course, while the clink of china provided a steady counterpoint. Miss Marple took a modest seat by the window, content to watch and listen. At a neighboring table, two gentlemen bent their heads over a broadsheet. Their voices were low but carried clearly enough, something about coastal surveys and a parcel not yet delivered. One of them, tall and angular, glanced nervously toward the doorway before folding the paper and excusing himself. After breakfast, Miss Marple made her way along a shadowed corridor lined with framed watercolors of the Sussex shore. The air smelled faintly of polish and old tobacco. Near the end of the passage, a door stood ajar, the reading room, she surmised. Inside, an elderly man with iron-gray hair sat behind a table strewn with books. "Good morning," he said, rising with old-fashioned courtesy. "Are you here for the local history group?" Miss Marple smiled and claimed a chair. "Not exactly, though I do find the past enlightening. One never knows how useful an understanding of yesterday can be to the puzzles of today." The man introduced himself as Mr. Linton, a retired schoolmaster who spent his days cataloguing the hotel's modest library. At Miss Marple's gentle prompting, he mentioned that Mr. Lysander, or whatever his name truly was, had often borrowed volumes on maritime law and the history of smuggling along the coast. He had also, Linton added with a hint of puzzlement, asked peculiar questions about tides and secluded inlets. Later, while strolling the terrace, Miss Marple encountered Pomeroy the waiter. He discreetly handed her a slip of paper, a copy of the message Lysander had left at the desk before vanishing. If anyone should inquire, it read in a neat but hurried script, "Tell them the parcel must not leave Willowbrook until I give word." Miss Marple folded the note, her face composed though her eyes gleamed. So, the burden that weighed on Mr. Hargreaves had been placed there deliberately, and with some urgency. As the day waned, she walked along the shingle beach, skirts lifting in the salt breeze. She considered each thread, a missing guest who studied tides, a village man carrying a parcel, a hotel steeped in harmless gentility yet curiously touched by secrecy. By the time the lamps along the promenade flickered to life, she had decided on her next step. Before leaving Westover, she would visit the cove mentioned in an old smuggling tale Mr. Linton had described. If the empty bed in Willowbrook pointed anywhere, she suspected it might be toward that stretch of lonely coast where the sea could hide as much as it revealed. Chapter 14. Secrets by the Tide. The morning broke in a haze of sea mist, softening the outline of the Westover cliffs. Miss Marple stood at her window fastening the small brass clasp of her handbag. A faint thrill of purpose ran through her. Years of quiet observation had taught her that when a clue led one outdoors, it was rarely wise to ignore it. She set out after breakfast, walking stick tapping lightly on the flagstones of the promenade. Beyond the tidy terraces, a narrow lane sloped towards the headland where gorse bushes clung stubbornly to the chalk. From there, a path dipped steeply to a secluded curve of shingle, the very spot Mr. Linton had marked on a dog-eared map of old smuggling haunts. The cove was almost deserted. Only a pair of fishermen, knee-deep in surf, were tending to their nets farther along the beach. Miss Marple chose a sheltered perch beside a weathered breakwater and let her eyes wander. The tide was on the ebb, leaving behind ribbons of weed and small pools that glimmered like scattered mirrors. After a patient interval, she noticed something that did not belong, a patch of disturbed pebbles near the shadow of the cliff. She stooped slowly so as not to draw the fisherman's attention, and brushed aside the stones. A scrap of waxed canvas peeped through. She tugged gently, revealing a corner of oilskin, water-stained but sound. Miss Marple did not attempt to open it there. Instead, she reburied the find, arranging the stones with the neatness of one who respected both evidence and nature's order. Rising carefully, she cast a calm glance about. No one had taken notice. On her return to the hotel, she paused at a bench overlooking the sweep of the bay. The air smelled of salt and kelp, and the cries of gulls wheeled overhead. She considered what she had seen. The parcel, almost certainly linked to Hargreaves's burden, had been hidden with deliberate care. Its presence here suggested a journey that wound from Willowbrook to Westover and back again, bound by some secret strong enough to cross counties. That evening, as the fog rolled in from the sea, Miss Marple sat in the lounge with her knitting, outwardly absorbed in counting stitches. But her thoughts were far from idle. Someone in either the hotel or the village had taken extraordinary pains to hide a small package on a lonely beach, and another person, poor anxious Hargreaves, had been drawn into the affair like a moth circling a lamp. The truth, she reflected, was edging closer, borne in on each receding tide. Yet she sensed that to uncover it she must tread very carefully, for the same tide that revealed could just as easily sweep evidence and people out of reach. Chapter 15. Shadows over the Green. By the time dusk spread its lavender haze across Willowbrook, the village seemed outwardly calm. Hens settling in their coops, lamps winking behind lace curtains, yet an undercurrent of restlessness threaded through its lanes. News traveled in whispers. Miss Marple was still away at the seaside, and Sergeant Riggs had been seen with papers under his arm, an ominous sign to those who loved a quiet life. At the Willowbrook Arms, Riggs sat with George Hayling in a corner of the public bar. Spread before them was a creased map and a stack of notes. Riggs, scowling in concentration, traced a line between the inn and the river path. "Too much wandering at night for my liking," he muttered. "That chap Hargreaves is always out in weather no sensible man would choose." George looked doubtful. "He's harmless enough, Sergeant. Keeps himself to himself." "That's what bothers me," Riggs replied. "Keeps himself to himself, and keeps something else if I'm not mistaken." He folded the map and rose, leaving his half-finished pint untouched. Outside, the lamps along the green had just been lit, casting pools of yellow on the damp grass. Riggs made his way towards Hargreaves's cottage, his boots crunching softly over gravel. Inside, Hargreaves sat rigid by the hearth, the satchel resting in its drawer like a live thing. He had spent the afternoon pacing, unable to shake the sense that threads were tightening around him. The creak of the gate outside froze him mid-step. A moment later came a knock, firm but not unkind. Riggs entered at Hargreaves's uneasy invitation, eyes flicking over the room. "Evening, sir. Thought I'd check you'd not been bothered since our talk." Hargreaves forced a laugh that landed awkwardly. "No bother. Just keeping busy." The sergeant eased himself onto a chair, removing his hat. "Funny thing," he began, voice casual. "I've had word there may be items belonging to the gentleman who disappeared from the Arms. Letters, perhaps. Something about a parcel meant to stay in Willowbrook until further notice." Hargreaves felt his throat tighten. He reached for the poker, stirred the fire, and avoided the other man's gaze. "I've no idea about any parcels." Riggs studied him for a long moment, saying nothing. Then, with a briskness that only half concealed concern, he stood. "All right, Mr. Hargreaves. But if anything odd comes your way, best hand it over before it causes trouble." When the door closed behind him, Hargreaves sank back into his chair, sweat beading his brow despite the fire's warmth. The satchel in the drawer might as well have been glowing through the wood, its weight pressing against his thoughts. He poured himself a measure of brandy, hands unsteady. Outside, the village lay hushed, only the faint trickle of the river breaking the silence. Somewhere far off a dog barked. Then all was still. Hargreaves stared at the fire, knowing he stood at a crossroads, to cling to the secret or to seek help before it consumed him. Chapter 16. Threads at the Seaside. The fog that had rolled over Westover in the night was thinning when Miss Marple descended for breakfast. Through the dining room windows the sea gleamed pewter, restless under a pale sun. Guests clustered near the sideboard, chattering about tides and bathing machines, while the aroma of toast and coffee lent the room its morning warmth. Miss Marple chose a seat by the window and unfolded her napkin with deliberate calm. She had slept lightly, roused more than once by the muffled boom of surf on shingle, a sound that seemed to echo the puzzle turning over in her mind. The empty bed, the parcel hidden by the tide, and poor Mr. Hargreaves with anxiety written across every line of his face. After breakfast she strolled along the terrace, pausing to study the line where the beach curved into a headland. The cove where she had found the oilskin scrap was empty now, washed smooth by the retreating sea. Only a dark wedge of rock showed where she had knelt the day before. In the lounge she found Pomeroy polishing glassware with his usual discretion. At her gentle questioning, he admitted that the gentleman known as Lysander had paid for a week but stayed only 3 nights, leaving word that he might return for a package. He had taken nothing with him except a valise and a small notebook. Miss Marple thanked him, reflecting that the package must be the same item entrusted to Hargreaves. There was purpose in every movement of the vanished guest, a chain running from Westover's quiet corridors to a hidden spot on the Sussex shore, and on again to the Willowbrook River path. By mid-afternoon the mist had burned away to reveal a sky as blue as Wedgwood china. Miss Marple packed her modest case, carefully folding her knitting atop her spare cardigan. She left a note for Pomeroy requesting the address of Mr. Linton, for an inquiry about old maps. Before the last train she allowed herself a final walk along the promenade. Children were flying kites on the sand, their laughter borne on the wind. Watching them, she thought how often the gravest matters moved unseen among scenes of apparent simplicity. A misplaced trust, a message delayed, a single ill-considered errand. Such things could ripple outward until even a village inn or a seaside hotel felt the tug. That evening, as the train steamed north, Miss Marple settled by the window, her hands folded over her bag. Lamps gleamed across the downs as twilight deepened, and she felt an odd stirring of sympathy for whoever had set this quiet mischief in motion. She would need tact, and perhaps a touch of firmness, when she returned to Willowbrook. For secrets kept too long, she knew, could weigh a soul down until it chose desperate paths. Chapter 17. Return to Willowbrook. The evening train set Miss Marple down at Willowbrook Small Station just as the first stars pricked the darkening sky. A fine drizzle hung in the air, softening the lamps along the platform and giving the hedgerows a silvery sheen. She stepped down carefully, carpet-bag in one hand, umbrella in the other, and took a moment to breathe in the familiar scent of damp earth and wood smoke. A handful of passengers dispersed into the lanes, leaving her alone with the porter, who touched his cap and offered to carry her bag. She declined with a gentle smile, preferring to walk the short distance to her cottage. As she crossed the green, she felt the quiet pulse of the village settling for the night. Dogs curled in baskets, supper dishes stacked to dry, voices fading behind curtained windows. At her gate she paused. A faint glow shone through her parlor curtains. Mrs. Partridge, as promised, had lit the fire and left a small supper tray on the table. Beside it lay an envelope addressed in Harriet Blake's unmistakable round hand. Urgent, brought by Billy Carter. Miss Marple read the note slowly. Mr. Hargreaves much agitated. Keeps to himself. Sergeant Riggs been round asking. H. Blake. She set the paper down, poured herself a modest cup of tea, and settled into the armchair by the hearth. The flames danced quietly as she considered the next step. She sensed that Hargreaves, beset by both guilt and fear, was edging closer to some decision, and that Riggs, though bluff, was observant enough to notice. After a light supper she donned her shawl and stepped out again. The drizzle had cleared. A damp clarity hung over the village. Lights gleamed in the windows of the Willowbrook Arms, and across the green the faint shape of Hargreaves's cottage showed against the hedge. She did not knock that evening. Haste, she had learned, often spoiled delicate work. Instead she made a circuit along the river path, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The water ran swift and black under the low bridge, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Somewhere a barn owl gave its soft, questioning cry. By the time she returned home the hour was late, Yet sleep was far away. She tidied her writing desk, arranged her knitting, and sat along while gazing at the fire. The picture forming in her mind was still incomplete, but she felt its edges sharpening. A man who feared exposure, a parcel that had crossed counties, and a visitor who had studied tides, they were bound together, waiting for one calm voice to coax them into the light. Tomorrow, she thought, she would speak quietly with Hargreaves. She would listen, as she always did, for what people meant as much as for what they said. And perhaps, before many more nights had passed, the mystery of the empty bed would begin to loosen its hold on Willowbrook. Chapter 18. The Conversation by the Hearth. Morning sunlight slanted through Miss Marple's curtains, catching on the steam rising from her breakfast tea. She had slept lightly, her thoughts circling Hargreaves and the curious burden that kept him pacing at night. By 9:30 she tied her scarf beneath her chin, took up her umbrella, and set off across the village green. Hargreaves's cottage sat quiet behind its hedge, a wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. She knocked softly. After a pause long enough for doubt to stir, the door opened. Hargreaves stood there, pale from another sleepless night, his collar askew. "Good morning, Mr. Hargreaves," she said with kindly composure. "I wondered if you might spare a few minutes. It's a fine day for a little talk indoors." He hesitated, glancing past her toward the lane, then stepped aside. The parlor was warm from a newly kindled fire, though the air seemed heavy with unspoken words. Miss Marple settled herself in an armchair while Hargreaves remained standing, fingers restless against the mantel. "I imagine," she began gently, "that something has weighed on you since that poor gentleman left the Willowbrook Arms. It can be difficult, when one finds oneself keeping another person's secret." His jaw tightened. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet sympathy. "I think you do. I also think you are an honorable man who found himself in a task for which you were not prepared." She folded her hands. "It is often so. People drawn into matters not of their making." Hargreaves's shoulders sagged a fraction. He sank into the chair opposite her, staring at the fire. "He asked me to look after something," he muttered at last. "Said it wasn't safe in the hotel. I meant only to keep it till he came back." Miss Marple inclined her head, inviting him to continue. "He said if anything happened I was to take it to—" Well, he didn't finish. "Then the news came about that bed at the inn, and I didn't know what to do." He passed a hand across his brow. "I thought perhaps I should destroy it, but it didn't seem right." Miss Marple waited until the silence settled. "You still have the parcel?" "Yes." "Locked away?" He gave a humorless laugh. "I daren't even look at it." She reached out, laying a gentle hand on the arm of his chair. "Mr. Hargreaves, whatever is inside, secrecy will not protect anyone now. If we are to understand what befell Mr. Lysander, we must examine what he entrusted to you." For a moment he seemed poised to protest. Then, with a sigh that sounded almost like relief, he nodded. Rising, he crossed to a small drawer, withdrew the familiar satchel, and placed it carefully on the table. The leather was worn from anxious handling. Miss Marple regarded it gravely. She did not reach for the clasp just yet. Some puzzles, she knew, demanded that the truth emerge in its own unhurried way. Instead, she said softly, "Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves. We shall take this one step at a time." Outside, the autumn morning gleamed pale and clear, but inside the cottage the air was taut with expectation. The mystery, long circling at the edges of their lives, was finally drawing into the light. Chapter 19. The Parcel's Secret. Miss Marple regarded the satchel in silence for a heartbeat, letting its presence settle between them. Mr. Hargreaves sat stiffly on the edge of his chair, hands clenched on his knees. "I think," she said at last, "that we should have a look together. It may not be so dreadful as you fear." He swallowed, then nodded. She eased the strap through its buckle, fingers careful but unhurried, and drew back the worn leather flap. Inside lay a neat bundle wrapped in brown paper and tied with faded blue twine. A faint scent of old ink drifted up. Miss Marple untied the string and peeled back the paper. Two objects emerged, a small notebook, battered at the corners, and a heavy envelope sealed with dark wax. She laid them on the table, noting the tremor in Hargreaves's hands. The notebook proved to be a journal. Pages filled in a firm, elegant script. Dates ran from the spring of the previous year to only a fortnight ago. Some entries were brief, but others sprawled across the page in tense, hurried lines. Several mentioned meetings in quiet lanes, odd arrangements about deliveries, and a certain S or R, always written with care, as if the writer had feared discovery. Miss Marple turned to the envelope. The wax bore no crest, merely a pressed thumbprint. She looked at Hargreaves, who gave a reluctant nod. She slipped a hairpin from her sleeve and teased the flap open. Inside were 2 items: a folded map of the estuary near Marleycombe, with points marked in red pencil, and a letter. The letter was written in the same precise hand as the journal. It warned of an exchange planned under cover of darkness and urged caution. If anything should happen to me, see that this reaches someone trustworthy. The matter concerns more than myself. A life may depend on it. Miss Marple laid the papers down, eyes thoughtful. So, she murmured, Mr. Lysander was not only a guest at an inn. He was entangled in something far wider. Hargreaves stared at the documents. I didn't know what he'd given me, only that he seemed frightened. Miss Marple nodded gently. And you, quite rightly, kept it safe. But now, Mr. Hargreaves, we must take the next step. Sergeant Riggs ought to be told, though I suspect we should be careful how we present it. There may be more at stake than the reputation of an inn. She rewrapped the papers, placing them neatly back in the satchel. As she did, she caught sight of movement beyond the curtained window, just the briefest flicker like a shadow withdrawing. Her brows lifted slightly. Did you expect visitors? She asked lightly. Hargreaves shook his head. Miss Marple rose and crossed to the window. The lane outside was empty, yet she could not shake the sense of watchful eyes. Someone, it seemed, had an interest in what Mr. Hargreaves had been hiding. She turned back, calm but alert. Perhaps, she said, we should put these in a safer place before we seek Sergeant Riggs. The kettle on Hargreaves's hob began to whistle, breaking the stillness. But Miss Marple's mind was already leaping ahead, weighing possibilities. The puzzle's pieces were taking shape, and somewhere beyond the quiet lane, the person who had left a bed empty was still determined that the truth should stay buried. Chapter 20. The Watcher in the Lane. A figure stood perfectly still among the hazel bushes that lined the narrow lane behind Hargreaves's cottage. A dull gray coat blended with a hedgerow, and a brimmed hat shadowed sharp eyes. Whoever they were, they had been waiting there for some time, patient as a cat before a mousehole. When the curtains of the parlor had twitched, the watcher stiffened, but Miss Marple's calm silhouette had soon retreated from the window. Slowly, carefully, the watcher leaned forward again, listening. Through the half-open window floated the faintest murmur of voices, the old woman's gentle tones, Hargreaves's strained replies, and once the dry scrape of paper on wood. The watcher frowned. So, the satchel had been opened at last. That meant time was running short. A movement in the village beyond caught their attention. Sergeant Riggs crossing the green, notebook tucked under his arm. The watcher sank lower among the shrubs until only the hat brim showed. A narrow escape. Riggs had a way of appearing at inconvenient moments. When the sergeant had passed, the watcher eased backward, slipping down the lane toward the river path. Damp leaves muffled every step. There, beneath the arching alders, a small rowing boat waited, hidden under a tarpaulin. The watcher crouched, checked that the parcel concealed inside remained undisturbed, and untied the painter from its stake. For a moment they paused, scanning the quiet water. Mist drifted across the surface, catching the thin autumn sun. The watcher's face, no more than a pale shape under the brim, hardened with resolve. There would be no second chance. If Miss Marple or the police gained the upper hand, months of careful planning would crumble. They pushed off, the oars cutting a silent rhythm. The boat slid downstream, carrying its hidden cargo toward the estuary and the red-penciled marks on Lysander's map. Somewhere, perhaps that very night, a meeting was to take place, one that would decide whether the truth about the empty bed remained secret forever. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple was fastening the satchel strap, her expression mild. She could not know she had just brushed the edge of a much larger design. but instinct as steady as the ticking clock on Hargreaves's mantel warned her that the village's stillness was only an illusion. Threads were tightening, and the killer, or killers, were already moving to cover their tracks.